Welcome to another dark journey through the forgotten corners of American history. Before we begin tonight's story, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear has been actively suppressed for over 2 centuries. The events I'll describe took place in 1776 in a remote hollow of the Appalachian Mountains, but the echoes of what happened there still haunt the region today. Some locals refuse to speak about it, and several archives have misplaced the original documents. If you're watching from anywhere near Boone County, you might recognize some of the landmarks I'll mention, but I urge you not to seek them out. Some places should remain forgotten, some stories untold. Before we start, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I'm curious how far this story will travel, and whether it might reach the ears of those who still remember the Hannons. The journey to Hannon Hollow was never an easy one, even in the best of times. In 1776, when our story begins, the area was still considered frontier, a wild, largely unmapped region where the authority of the colonies barely reached. The narrow path that led there wound between steep ridges, a treacherous route that even experienced hunters approached with caution. Ancient oaks and towering pines pressed in from both sides, their branches creating a natural tunnel that seemed to swallow travelers whole. Those who made the trip spoke of a peculiar transition, how the bird songs would gradually fade until the only sound was the creak of wagon wheels or the labored breathing of horses. By the time the hollow itself came into view, most visitors were already uneasy, though few could articulate exactly why. The approach was marked by 3 distinctive landmarks that locals used as waypoints. First came Widow's Stone, a massive boulder split cleanly down the middle, creating a narrow passage just wide enough for a wagon. Legend held that a settler's wife had died there waiting for her husband's return during the harsh winter of 1738. Some claimed to hear weeping when passing between the stone halves on particularly cold days. A mile beyond stood Crooked Pine, a massive tree that grew almost parallel to the ground before twisting upward toward the sky. Children were warned never to climb it, though none could say exactly why the prohibition existed. The final marker was Preacher's View, a small clearing that offered the first glimpse of the hollow below. Supposedly, a traveling minister had stopped there in 1759, gazed down at the settlement, and immediately turned back, claiming God had shown him what truly lived in that place. He refused to elaborate and never returned to the region. They called it Hannon Hollow, an isolated community nestled between 2 ridges so steep that winter sunlight touched the valley floor for only a few hours each day. The Hannon family had settled there after fleeing Ireland during the famine of the 1740s, establishing themselves at a time when the frontier was still wild and largely unmapped. Jeremiah Hannon, the patriarch, had arrived with nothing but a book of strange symbols and an unnatural knowledge of what lay beneath the earth. He'd walked the mountains for weeks before stopping suddenly in what would become the hollow, declaring, "This is where the world wears thin. This is where we belong." Within a decade, he had established a small but productive coal mining operation, extracting the black mineral from seams that ran through the mountainside. By 1776, as the colonies were declaring their independence from England, Jeremiah was an aging but still formidable figure, a hard man, who ran both his modest mining operation and his household with an iron grip. His weathered log house stood at the highest point of the settlement, overlooking the half-dozen smaller cabins scattered through the hollow. From his front porch, Jeremiah could see everything, or so he believed. The house itself was a curious structure, built according to unusual specifications. Its proportions seemed slightly wrong somehow. Windows placed at odd heights, doorways a few inches too narrow or too wide, stairs with treads of inconsistent depth. Visitors often reported feeling disoriented inside, though they couldn't pinpoint why. Local carpenters, who had helped with repairs over the years, whispered about strange measurements Jeremiah had insisted upon, claiming they maintained harmony with the threshold. No one knew what that meant, but the phrase had entered local parlance as an explanation for the Hannons' many eccentricities. The Hannon property included the main house where Jeremiah lived with his wife Margaret, their youngest son Thomas, age 12, and Jeremiah's aging mother, Gertrude. Margaret had once been considered a great beauty, with copper hair and unusually pale skin. By 1776, that beauty remained but had taken on a fragile, almost translucent quality. She moved through the house like a ghost, speaking rarely, her green eyes perpetually distant, as if focused on something others couldn't see. She had married Jeremiah at 16, following a courtship so brief it sparked gossip that continued decades later. Whatever passion might have existed between them had long since been replaced by something else, not quite devotion, not quite fear, but a complex blend of both. The old woman Gertrude rarely left her room on the second floor, though people visiting the yard sometimes reported seeing her silhouette at the window, watching. Those who had glimpsed her on the rare occasions she ventured downstairs described a tiny bent figure with impossibly ancient features, yet hair still raven black, despite her advanced age. She spoke only in whispers and never directly to anyone outside the family. Servants claimed she conducted strange rituals in her room at night, burning unknown substances that produced oddly colored smoke, chanting in a language that wasn't English or any European tongue they recognized. Jeremiah dismissed these stories as superstitious nonsense, but never allowed visitors above the first floor. Their oldest son, James, had his own cabin nearby with his wife, Martha, and their infant daughter, Lily. James was the most conventional of the Hannons, having spent 2 years apprenticed to a merchant in Philadelphia before returning to help manage the family businesses. Thoughtful and methodical, he lacked his father's intimidating presence, but commanded respect through his fairness and intelligence. His relationship with Jeremiah was noticeably strained, marked by clipped conversations and long silences. James had married Martha Bennett from a respectable family in Williamsburg, a cultured young woman who had met him during his time away from the Hollow. Their cabin, unlike the main house, was built in a modern style with large windows and a wraparound porch. Martha had attempted to create a normal family life there, despite the Hollow's oppressive atmosphere and her in-laws' peculiarities. The middle son, William, occupied another cabin with his wife, Rebecca. Where James was thoughtful, William was intense, quick to anger, quick to laugh, unpredictable in his moods. He worked primarily in the mines, preferring physical labor to the management responsibilities his father and older brother handled. William was Jeremiah's clear favorite, the only person who could make the stern patriarch smile. His cabin reflected his personality, Spartan, functional, with few decorations or comforts. Rebecca, his wife of 2 years, came from a respected family in Williamsburg and had never fully adjusted to life in the Hollow. Servants gossiped about frequent arguments between the couple, about Rebecca's tearful letters to her parents, and about the bruises she sometimes failed to conceal. William's temper was well known, but no one dared interfere in Hannon family matters. An unmarried daughter, Catherine, lived in the main house but spent most days teaching the handful of children from the surrounding homesteads. At 26, she was considered a spinster, though her striking looks, she had her mother's copper hair and her father's intense dark eyes, had attracted many suitors over the years. Jeremiah had turned them all away for reasons he never explained. Catherine accepted this with the same quiet resignation that characterized her entire existence. The children she taught both feared and adored her. She was strict but never cruel, demanding excellence while displaying unexpected patience with slower learners. Like all Hannons, she spoke little, but when she did, people listened. There was something hypnotic about her low, melodious voice that made even the most restless child sit still and pay attention. The Hannons were not the only family in the Hollow, though they owned most of it. The Jenkins family operated the small trading post, which stocked essential supplies and served as the only regular connection to the outside world. Old man Jenkins had come with Jeremiah from Ireland, their families linked by some connection that predated their arrival in America. The Morrisons, Taylors, and Crawfords All worked for the Hannons in some capacity, living in modest cabins that huddled near the base of the eastern ridge. A few other families were scattered throughout the hollow, most connected to the Hannons through marriage or long-standing work arrangements. All told, perhaps 40 people called Hannon Hollow home in 1776. What set the Hannons apart wasn't just their relative prosperity in a region where most settlers struggled to survive. It was their peculiar ways, traditions brought from the old country, that seemed odd to their neighbors but were accepted without question within the family. They never allowed mirrors in their homes. They carved strange symbols above doorways and windows. They would not eat meat on the first day of each month. Most notable was their silence, not a complete absence of speech, but a noticeable economy of words. Jeremiah Hannon could conduct an entire business transaction using just nods, gestures, and the occasional terse phrase. His children had inherited this trait, speaking only when necessary, their voices soft and measured. The locals had their theories about these peculiarities. Some attributed them to the family's Old World origins, suggesting the Hannons had brought obscure Irish customs with them. Others whispered about a family curse, pointing to the unusual number of accidents and deaths that had plagued the Hannons over the years. The more superstitious claimed the family had made a pact with something that lived in the mountains, not God or the devil, but something older and more ambiguous. Whatever the truth, the Hannons' eccentricities were tolerated because of their economic power. They provided jobs, stability, and relative prosperity in a region where such things were rare. The valley floor contained several distinctive features beyond the human settlement. A creek unusually clear and cold, even in summer, wound through the center, occasionally disappearing underground, only to emerge hundreds of yards away. Local children claimed it flowed backward during the dark of the moon, though none would venture close enough at night to verify this. A perfect circle of massive stones sat at the western end of the hollow, each boulder too large to have been moved by human hands, yet arranged with obvious deliberation. Jeremiah had built his first cabin near this circle, though later, after his prosperity increased, he constructed the main house at a distance from it. The stones were carved with symbols similar to those found on certain ancient monuments, though travelers who had seen such things in Europe noted significant differences from any known historical examples. Most ominous was the mine entrance on the northern ridge. Originally the source of the Hannons' modest wealth, the main shaft had been sealed after a collapse in 1770, killed 3 men, including Jeremiah's youngest brother Edward. The entrance was now overgrown with brambles and surrounded by a split rail fence with warning signs. Yet despite these precautions, locals reported occasional sounds emerging from the sealed shaft, knocking, scraping, and what some described as singing too high for human voices. Jeremiah dismissed these reports and threatened to banish any worker caught spreading such stories. Spring came late to the mountains in 1776. March brought heavy snows instead of thaw, and April began with frost so severe it killed early plantings throughout the region. The delayed season put everyone on edge. Food stores were running low after the long winter, and the ground remained too hard for plowing. In Hannon Hollow, tension manifested in small ways: arguments at the trading post, increased accidents at the mine, unusual silence in Catherine's small schoolroom. Jeremiah spent more time than usual in his office, reviewing ledgers with increasing concern. The cold had damaged equipment and delayed shipments, resulting in financial pressures the family hadn't experienced in years. It was against this backdrop of communal anxiety that 12-year-old Thomas Hannon began to change. Always different from his siblings, more curious, more expressive, he became even more so as spring struggled to establish itself. He asked endless questions about the mine, about his grandmother's rituals, about the stone circle at the western end of the hollow. He drew strange diagrams that concerned Catherine enough that she brought them to Margaret's attention. He sleepwalked, sometimes being found in the yard or garden in his nightclothes, staring at the stars and muttering in what sounded like his grandmother's unknown language. Most disturbing, he began to exhibit an uncanny ability to predict minor events, which days would bring rain, which visitors would arrive unexpectedly, which animals would be born with unusual markings. Margaret fretted over these changes, consulting the local healer about remedies for night terrors and speaking fits. Jeremiah watched his youngest son with an expression that mixed concern with something harder to define, perhaps recognition. Catherine spent more time with Thomas, reading to him from selected books and teaching him what she called focusing exercises to help him remain calm. William avoided his youngest brother entirely, claiming the boy's strangeness made his skin crawl. Only James treated Thomas normally, taking him fishing when weather permitted and teaching him practical skills to ground him in everyday reality. The trouble began on April 12, 1776. It was a Tuesday, unseasonably warm after the prolonged winter, as if the season had completely skipped spring and lurched directly into summer heat. The sudden change in weather seemed to affect everyone's mood. Tempers flared at the mine. Children were unusually rowdy at school. Even the animals sensed something amiss. Dogs barked at nothing, chickens refused to roost at dusk, horses grew skittish in their stalls. Thomas spent that morning helping James repair a fence near the creek. After lunch, he asked permission to collect interesting rocks from the creek bed for a project Catherine had assigned. Margaret agreed, with the usual caution, not to wander too far. Thomas was last seen by Mrs. Crawford, who was hanging laundry behind her cabin. She reported that the boy was following the creek toward the western end of the hollow, carrying a small canvas bag and whistling a tune she didn't recognize. She thought nothing of it. Thomas was known for his solitary explorations, and all was returned home safely. But that evening, Thomas Hannon failed to appear for dinner. The family initially showed little concern. The boy often lost track of time and had always returned by nightfall. Thomas was different from the other Hannon children, more curious, more talkative, less bound by the family's unspoken rules. Margaret indulged this difference, perhaps seeing in her youngest a chance for a life beyond the hollow. Jeremiah tolerated it, though his frown deepened whenever Thomas spoke too loudly or asked too many questions. As darkness settled over the hollow and lanterns were lit, Margaret Hannon's calm facade began to crack. By 9 o'clock, she was pacing the front porch, peering into the darkness, and calling Thomas's name, a sound so unusual that it brought neighbors to their doors. The Hannons simply didn't behave this way. They didn't show emotion publicly. They didn't raise their voices. Yet here was Margaret, her copper hair loose and wild, her voice growing increasingly desperate as she called her son's name into the gathering night. By midnight, Jeremiah had organized the men from the surrounding homesteads into search parties. They combed the forests and creek beds through the night, calling the boy's name into the darkness, their voices echoing strangely in the dense woods. The hollow had never been so loud, yet the noise seemed to emphasize the underlying silence rather than break it. Lanterns formed a moving constellation through the trees, but their light seemed somehow dimmer than it should have been, as if the darkness had substance that resisted illumination. James led a group searching the eastern ridge, methodically covering every foot of the difficult terrain. William took men to the creek, following it all the way to where it joined the larger river 5 miles beyond the hollow. Jeremiah himself led the search near the abandoned mine, though he insisted no one approach the sealed entrance. Catherine stayed with Margaret and Gertrude in the main house, the old woman muttering continuously in her unknown language while rocking back and forth beside the fireplace. Morning came with no sign of Thomas. The search parties returned, exhausted and unsuccessful. Jeremiah sent riders to neighboring settlements, spreading word of the missing child. As news traveled, volunteers from miles around joined the search. For 3 days, they methodically covered every inch of the surrounding wilderness, the creek that ran through the valley floor, the old Indian trails that switchbacked up the ridges, the limestone caves that pockmarked the western slope. They found nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. It was as if Thomas had simply dissolved into the mountain air. The search efforts took on an increasingly desperate quality. Margaret collapsed from exhaustion and was confined to bed under the care of the local healer, who administered herbal tinctures to help her sleep. Jeremiah grew more withdrawn with each passing day, speaking even less than usual, his dark eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as if expecting something to emerge from the forest. James organized and led most of the search parties, his natural leadership abilities emerging in the crisis. William drank heavily in the evenings and lashed out at Rebecca when she suggested they pray for Thomas's safe return. "Prayer won't help," he reportedly told her, "not with what's out there." Catherine's reaction was perhaps the strangest. She continued teaching at the small schoolhouse as if nothing had happened, maintaining her normal schedule and lessons. When children asked about her brother, she simply said, "Thomas is finding his way," and changed the subject. In the evenings, she spent hours in Gertrude's room, the two women's whispers occasionally audible to servants passing in the hallway, though the words themselves were indecipherable. On the fourth day of the search, something peculiar happened. Rebecca, William's wife, approached Samuel Crawford privately as he was eating a cold lunch near the search area. Crawford, a respected elder in the community, had been leading one of the search parties since Thomas's disappearance. Unlike the Hannons by birth, Rebecca came from a cultured Williamsburg family and had never fully adapted to the Hollow's isolated ways. She still spoke normally, though her 2 years of marriage to William had left her jumpy and quick to fall silent when other family members appeared. With trembling hands, she showed Crawford a small leather shoe she claimed to have found near the old mine entrance. The shoe belonged to Thomas, she was certain, but she hadn't told Jeremiah about her discovery. "Why bring this to me instead of your father-in-law?" Crawford asked, turning the shoe over in his hands. It was indeed a child's shoe, well made, but worn at the toes, with the initials T.H. scratched into the inner sole. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder before answering, though they were alone at the edge of the forest. "There are things about this family you don't understand," she whispered. "Things I didn't understand until after I married William. The mine. Jeremiah doesn't want anyone going near it, not since the collapse. Says it's unsafe, but—" She fell silent, her eyes darting toward movement in the trees. "But what, Mrs. Hannon?" Crawford pressed. "I've seen Jeremiah go there at night, William too. They carry lanterns but don't light them until they're inside. They go deep inside, past the collapse. There's another way around it, a narrow passage. They carried something, I couldn't see what. I followed once, as far as I dared. There's a sound in there, like singing but not human voices. William caught me listening once. She touched her cheek briefly, where a fading bruise was still visible beneath her powder. He said if I ever spoke of it, I'd disappear like his aunt did. I don't know what that means, but I'm afraid for Thomas. I think he found something in there, something the family protects." "What could they possibly be protecting in an abandoned mine?" Crawford asked. Rebecca's voice dropped even lower. "Have you noticed how quiet it is in the hollow? Not just the people, everything. Fewer birds than there should be. No insect sounds at night. Even the creek seems to make less noise than it should. It's as if something's absorbing the sound. William talks in his sleep sometimes. He mentions the threshold and the quiet place. Says his grandfather found it in Ireland, and now the family has to maintain it. I don't know what it means, but I'm scared. If Thomas found his way into the mine—" She broke off suddenly, her face paling. Crawford turned to see Jeremiah Hannon standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them with his impenetrable dark eyes. How long he had been there, how much he had overheard, was impossible to determine. Rebecca mumbled an excuse about needing to prepare dinner, and hurried away, leaving Crawford alone with the family patriarch. "My daughter-in-law has an active imagination," Jeremiah said, his deep voice betraying no emotion. "The collapse sealed the mine completely. There is no other way around. If there were, we would have recovered my brother's body." Crawford studied the taller man carefully. "She found this near the entrance," he said, holding up the shoe. "Belongs to your boy, doesn't it?" Jeremiah took the shoe, examined it briefly, then handed it back. Thomas has several pairs much like this. Many children in the hollow wear similar shoes. It proves nothing. I'd like to take a look at that mine anyway, Crawford said, just to be thorough. Something flickered in Jeremiah's eyes, too brief to identify. Of course, but I'll need to arrange proper safety measures. The structure is unstable. Tomorrow morning would be best. Crawford agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being managed, directed away from something. He spent that night at the Jenkins home, declining the invitation to stay at the main Hannon house. Late in the evening, unable to sleep, he stood at his bedroom window and observed the hollow in moonlight. From this vantage point, he could see the main house on its hill and the dark shape of the mine entrance on the opposite ridge. As he watched, a light appeared briefly at the mine, a lantern being lit, then quickly hooded or extinguished. In the momentary illumination, he glimpsed a tall figure that could have been Jeremiah or William Hannon. The abandoned mine was searched thoroughly the next afternoon. Crawford brought in experienced miners from a neighboring settlement, men who knew how to navigate dangerous tunnels. Lanterns illuminated the first 100 yards of the main shaft before debris from the old collapse blocked further progress. The men examined the blockage carefully but found no passage around it, despite Rebecca's claim. Again, they found nothing related to Thomas's disappearance, no footprints in the dust, no recently disturbed areas, no sign that anyone had entered the mine recently. But as the search party emerged from the mine into the fading daylight, Samuel Crawford noticed something odd. Jeremiah Hannon was watching them from the tree line, unmoving, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, Jeremiah turned and walked away without a word. That evening Crawford questioned the family again in the main house. They sat in the parlor, Jeremiah and Margaret on wooden chairs, Catherine perched stiffly nearby, James and William standing by the cold fireplace. Martha and Rebecca were absent, tending to baby Lily, they said. The room was immaculate but oddly impersonal. No children's drawings, no items of sentimental value visible anywhere. The walls were bare except for a large map of the surrounding mountains and a family Bible on a small table. Crawford described the day's search efforts, then carefully mentioned the shoe Rebecca had shown him. "We found no sign of it in the mine," he concluded, watching their faces closely. "Your daughter-in-law seems to have been mistaken." No one spoke for several seconds. Then Jeremiah cleared his throat, a sound like stone grinding against stone. "Rebecca is unwell," he said flatly. "Has been since the baby died." "Baby?" Crawford frowned. "I thought only James and Martha had a child." "Rebecca lost one last winter," Margaret explained, her voice barely audible. "Born too early. She hasn't been right since. Sees things, finds things that aren't there. We've been patient with her confusion." Crawford made a mental note to ask the local midwife about this. A stillbirth would normally be known to the community, the infant buried in the family plot with a proper service. "And Thomas?" he asked. "Any new thoughts on where he might have gone?" The family exchanged glances, one of those silent communications that excluded outsiders. Finally Catherine spoke, her voice surprisingly deep for a woman of her slight build. "Thomas was always different, restless. He talked about leaving the hollow, seeing other places." She twisted her hands in her lap. "Maybe he just left." "He's 12 years old," Crawford said flatly. "Children that age don't just leave home without a trace." "You don't know Thomas," William muttered, the first words he'd spoken since Crawford arrived. "He wasn't like us." The way he said it, wasn't, not isn't, struck Crawford as odd, but before he could pursue the point, Jeremiah stood abruptly. "It's getting late. We appreciate your help, but my wife needs to rest. Unless you have new information?" Crawford had no choice but to leave, though the encounter left him troubled. As he mounted his horse in the yard, he noticed a light in an upstairs window, a thin, hunched silhouette visible against the curtain. The grandmother, he presumed, though he hadn't seen her during his visits. The shape remained motionless, watching as he rode away. He felt its eyes on his back long after the house disappeared from view. The next day, Crawford rode to the nearest larger settlement to check with the midwife who served the region. He found no record of Rebecca's supposed stillbirth, no memory of attending such a birth, nothing to suggest she had ever been pregnant. Disturbed by this discrepancy, he sent messages to contacts in Williamsburg, requesting background information on the Hannon family. Then he visited the elderly minister who had served the Hollow's spiritual needs for decades. Reverend Miller was a frail man who had ministered in the region since before the Hannons arrived. He received Crawford in his small cabin, offering him tea despite the early hour. When questioned about the Hannons, Miller grew visibly uncomfortable. Strange family, he admitted after several prompting questions. Always have been. I attended Margaret for all her childbirths, 4 of them. He paused, frowning. Though, come to think of it, there should have been 5. 5 children? Crawford asked sharply. I've only seen 4, James, William, Catherine, and the missing boy, Thomas. Miller rubbed his chin thoughtfully. There was another daughter, born between William and Catherine, I believe. Died young, 2 or 3 years old. Can't recall the cause now. Memory's not what it was. What was her name? Crawford pressed. That's the odd thing I can't remember. Normally I'd recall a child I baptized and later buried, especially one from a prominent family. But this one, he shook his head. It's as if there's a blank spot in my memory. I know she existed, but the details are missing. Crawford found similar gaps when he questioned other longtime residents. Everyone remembered that the Hannons had lost a daughter, but no one could recall her name, her appearance, or the exact circumstances of her death. It was as if a communal amnesia surrounded this particular child. The responses from Williamsburg were equally disturbing. The official church records there showed 5 Hannon children, not 4, but the 5th had no name, birth date, or death date, just a blank entry in the family Bible that had been copied into official records. Most intriguing was Crawford's discovery about the abandoned mine. County records showed that after the collapse that killed Jeremiah's brother Edward and 2 other men, the bodies of the other miners had been recovered and buried. But Edward's body had never been found, despite being in the same section of the mine as his co-workers. The official explanation cited the instability of the area where he had been working, but Crawford noted the inconsistency. If the area was too unstable to recover Edward's body, how had the other bodies been retrieved from the same location? 1 week after Thomas disappeared, the official search was called off. Crawford recorded in his journal that the boy had likely fallen into one of the many sinkholes or prospecting pits that dotted the mountains. These natural traps, he wrote, could swallow a body whole, leaving no trace. The community accepted this explanation, or at least they pretended to. Life in the hollow began to resume its normal rhythms, though a heaviness lingered in the air like the pressure before a storm. People spoke in whispers, as if afraid of being overheard. Children were kept close to home. The natural sounds of the forest, birdsong, insect chirps, the rustle of small animals in underbrush, seemed to diminish further, until visitors commented on the unnatural silence that blanketed the hollow. But Margaret Hannon did not accept the official explanation. Neighbors reported seeing her wandering the forest at odd hours, calling her son's name. Her previously copper hair turned white almost overnight, a physical manifestation of her grief. She carried Thomas's favorite book, a collection of Irish folk tales, wherever she went, as if the boy might suddenly appear and ask her to read to him as he had so many times before. Jeremiah would retrieve her from these wanderings, guiding her home with a firm hand on her elbow, his face impassive. The family retreated further into silence. The windows of the main house remained shuttered day and night, despite the pleasant spring weather. Meals were delivered to the doorstep by neighboring women, but the dishes often remained untouched until someone from the house collected them, usually after dark. Rebecca became even more reclusive. The bruise on her cheek was joined by others, though she wore high-necked dresses and long sleeves regardless of the warming weather, keeping the worst evidence hidden. William was seen walking to the abandoned mine entrance several times, carrying what appeared to be bundles of clothing. When questioned by a concerned neighbor, he claimed he was simply disposing of Thomas's belongings, too painful for his mother to see around the house. The explanation was accepted, though with some skepticism. Why throw a child's possessions into an abandoned mine? James threw himself into work, spending long hours managing the family's business interests. He rarely visited the main house now, and when he did, the encounters with his father were tense, borderline hostile. Martha was seen watching him anxiously whenever they appeared in public together, as if afraid he might say or do something dangerous. Their baby, Lily, grew fussy and prone to long crying jags that nothing seemed to soothe. The only person who could quiet her was, strangely enough, old Gertrude, who would rock the infant while singing in her unknown language. Catherine continued teaching, though parents noted a change in her methods. She introduced new material, complex geometric patterns, unusual alphabets, songs in what she called the old language. When questioned by concerned parents, she produced curriculum materials that seemed conventional enough, though several later admitted they couldn't actually remember what they had reviewed. Children began bringing home strange drawings, concentric circles, spirals, and arrangements of dots that formed constellations not visible in the night sky. When asked what these drawings represented, they would only say, "Miss Hannon says it's the quiet place," before changing the subject. Then, exactly 2 weeks after Thomas vanished, 12-year-old Mary Collins disappeared. Mary lived with her family in the neighboring hollow and had occasionally played with Thomas when the Hannons brought him to church or community gatherings. Her father worked in the Hannon mine, and her mother took in laundry from several of the hollow's more prosperous families. Mary was a bright, well-behaved child known for her singing voice and her skill with needlework. Like Thomas, she simply failed to return home one evening after being sent to collect eggs from the family's chicken coop. Unlike the Hannons, the Collins family's anguish was loud and public. They rushed through the community, knocking on doors, organizing immediate search parties, demanding action from anyone who would listen. By morning, the news had reached the neighboring settlements. Mary's uncle, who traded regularly with Williamsburg, brought in hunters and trackers from miles around to assist in the search. During this renewed search activity, the Hannons remained conspicuously absent. Jeremiah cited business commitments. William claimed illness. James initially joined a search party, but was called away by a supposed emergency at the mine. Catherine kept the school open, insisting structure was important for children during uncertain times. The family's lack of participation was noted and commented upon, adding to the growing suspicion in the community. 3 days later, Mary Collins was found alive. A trapper discovered her wandering along a creek bed 5 miles from home, disoriented and unable to explain where she'd been. Her clothes were torn and dirty, but she showed no signs of physical injury beyond scratches from brambles and blisters on her feet. Most peculiar was her hair. She had left home with neatly braided brown locks, but was found with her hair not only loose, but somehow altered. Witnesses described it as different and wrong, though they struggled to articulate exactly how. Some said it appeared darker. Others claimed it had acquired a reddish tint like Margaret Hannon's copper hair. Her parents later cut it short, refusing to discuss the matter. After being examined by the local healer, Mary was deemed physically unharmed but severely traumatized. She spoke very little, and when she did, her voice had acquired an odd cadence, rising and falling in patterns that didn't match natural speech. When questioned about her disappearance, she would only say one thing, over and over. "The quiet people took me to see Thomas." This phrase, delivered in her new sing-song voice, chilled all who heard it. Samuel Crawford, conducting the interview, pressed for details. Who were these quiet people? Where had they taken her? What did Thomas look like? Was he hurt? Was he still alive? Mary's only response was to repeat the same sentence, sometimes whispering it, sometimes nearly shouting, but always with that unnatural rhythm that made listeners' skin crawl. Crawford continued his attempts to question her for 2 days. During this time, Mary refused food and barely slept. She would stare fixedly at blank walls or empty corners of the room, occasionally raising her hand as if waving to someone only she could see. On the third day she suffered what the healer described as a nervous fit, convulsing violently, foaming at the mouth, her eyes rolling back to show only the whites. When the episode passed, she fell into a deep sleep that lasted nearly 24 hours. Upon waking, Mary seemed calmer, but even more detached from reality. She no longer repeated the phrase about Thomas and the quiet people. Instead, she wouldn't speak at all. She communicated through nods or head shakes, or by drawing peculiar symbols that resembled those Catherine Hannon had been teaching at the school. Her parents eventually refused further questioning, insisting their daughter needed rest. Crawford noted in his journal that the girl might have fabricated the story about Thomas after overhearing adults discussing his disappearance, then suffered a psychological break due to the stress of her ordeal. The case of Mary Collins was officially attributed to a child wandering off and becoming lost, a common enough occurrence in the mountains. But her words, "The quiet people took me to see Thomas," spread through the surrounding communities like wildfire. Suspicion fell on the Hannon family with their reputation for silence and seclusion. Some recalled old rumors about Jeremiah and strange rituals in the woods. Others pointed to the family's unusual prosperity in a region where most barely subsisted. Most of these accusations were made in whispers, behind closed doors. No one confronted the Hannons directly. The Collins family, once fixtures of community life, withdrew from social interaction almost as completely as the Hannons. They kept Mary at home, no longer allowing her to attend school or church. Visitors reported that the girl would sit for hours by a window, staring toward the distant ridge where the abandoned mine entrance was located. She had begun humming tunelessly, or rather, in a tune no one else could recognize or reproduce. Most disturbing were the drawings that covered her bedroom walls, hundreds of them, all showing the same image, a vertical black line surrounded by stick figures with oversized, hollow eyes. When asked what the drawings represented, Mary would only smile faintly and return to her humming. No one except Samuel Crawford dared to pursue the connection between Thomas's disappearance and Mary's experience. On May 10th, almost a month after Thomas disappeared, Crawford rode alone to the Hannon property. The day was unseasonably hot, the air thick with pollen, and the sweet smell of mountain laurel in bloom. He found Jeremiah splitting wood behind the main house, his shirt dark with sweat despite the early hour. The conversation that followed was recorded in Crawford's personal journal, discovered decades later. I asked him straight, what did Mary Collins mean about the quiet people and Thomas? Jeremiah set down his axe and looked at me for a long time. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Not grief or anger, but something older, colder. Then he said, "There are things in these mountains older than your settlements, Crawford. Some questions are dangerous to ask." When I pressed him, he pointed to the axe at his feet and said, "My boy is gone. Nothing will change that. Go home, for your own good." The threat was clear, so I left. But I'm going back tomorrow with men I trust. Something is wrong in that hollow, wrong in that family. I've requested the church records for the entire Hannon clan going back to their arrival in the colonies. There's a pattern here I'm missing. Crawford's journal continued with several pages of notes on the Hannon family history. He had discovered that in each generation, at least one child had died under unclear circumstances or disappeared entirely. Jeremiah's younger sister, his own unnamed daughter, each family branch had lost a child around the age of 12. In each case, the deaths had been explained away with vague references to illness or accident, but proper documentation was consistently absent. Crawford never returned to Hannon Hollow to pursue these questions. That night, his cabin burned to the ground with him and his family inside. The fire was attributed to an unattended hearth. No investigation followed. No one else pursued the matter of Thomas Hannon's disappearance. The subject became taboo in the surrounding communities. Summer came to the mountains. Life in Hannon Hollow settled into an uneasy routine. Jeremiah continued to manage his small mining operation, though workers noted he spent more time in his office behind a locked door, strange sounds occasionally emanating from within, not quite speech, not quite singing, but something between the two. Margaret was rarely seen. Catherine stopped teaching the local children, claiming illness. William and Rebecca's cabin often stood dark for days at a time, though smoke occasionally rose from their chimney. Only James and his family maintained some semblance of normal life, tending their garden and caring for their infant daughter. The wider community kept its distance from the Hannons. Church attendance from the hollow dwindled. Trade with neighboring areas decreased. Children were kept close to home, no longer allowed to play in the woods alone. Travelers began to avoid the path that passed near Hannon land, adding miles to their journeys rather than risk the shortcut through the hollow. The isolation that had always characterized the place deepened, becoming almost complete. Then came the messages. In late June, 3 prominent families in the region received identical marks carved into their cabin doors, a vertical line with several shorter lines crossing it, resembling a crude ladder. No one claimed responsibility, but within days, similar markings began appearing elsewhere, cut into tree trunks along well-traveled paths, scratched into stones at creek crossings, formed with sticks on the ground near homesteads. All was the same symbol, which an elderly Cherokee later identified as representing a passage between worlds. The markings might have been dismissed as vandalism, were it not for one detail that was never made public. Each recipient of a carved symbol discovered that they could no longer see their reflection in water or polished metal. The effect lasted exactly 3 days before disappearing as suddenly as it had come. None of those affected discussed this experience openly, fearing they would be considered mad or possessed. Only years later, when a scholar collecting oral histories recorded similar accounts from multiple unconnected sources, did the pattern emerge. By August, fear had taken hold of the entire region. Families fortified their cabins, men carried rifles, even on short walks. Religious gatherings grew in size and fervor as people sought protection in faith. No one spoke directly about the Hannons, but glances turned their way whenever another marking was found. The family remained secluded, indifferent to the growing hysteria. Then the dreams began. People throughout the region reported similar nightmares, standing in a dark tunnel with water dripping somewhere nearby, hearing a child singing an unfamiliar tune, feeling unseen presences moving around them in the blackness. Many described waking with the taste of coal dust in their mouths, their bedsheets soiled with what looked like mine dirt, though they had not been near any mines. Most disturbing were the accounts from children who spoke of a boy named Thomas visiting their rooms at night, asking them to follow him to the quiet place where everyone understands without talking. The number of children reporting these dreams increased through late August, reaching a peak around the time of the harvest moon. Parents took extreme measures, locking bedroom doors from the outside, taking turns keeping watch through the night. Some families sent their children to stay with relatives in distant towns, hoping distance would provide protection from whatever was happening. A traveling revival preacher who arrived in the area held nightly services focused on cleansing the region of unnatural influences. Attendance swelled until his tent could no longer hold the crowds. On September 3rd, Rebecca Hannon vanished. William reported her missing, claiming she had gone to gather blackberries and never returned. Her picking basket was found near the entrance to the old mine, overturned, berries scattered across the ground. Unlike the earlier disappearances, this one prompted almost no community response. No search was organized. No one volunteered to help. The residents of neighboring hollows crossed themselves when they heard the news and locked their doors that night. Mary Collins, still mute but increasingly agitated, began writing the same phrase repeatedly in her school primer. Rebecca sees Thomas now. Rebecca understands. When her parents discovered the writings, they burned the book and kept Mary confined to her room. That night, all the polished metal surfaces in their house tarnished simultaneously, though no one had touched them. 3 days later, William himself disappeared. His cabin was found immaculate, the bed made, a cold cup of coffee on the table, his pipe laid out with tobacco ready to be lit. The perfectionist attention to order was completely out of character for the usually chaotic William. No search was organized for him either. The authorities took no action beyond making a brief note in the church records. James Hannon told those who asked that his brother and sister-in-law had gone east to visit family. Few believed him, but none challenged the explanation. As autumn painted the mountains in fiery hues, strange incidents multiplied around Hannon Hollow. Livestock disappeared or was found mutilated in ways that defied explanation. Cows with perfect circular incisions in their hides, chickens arranged in geometric patterns with their heads pointing toward the Hannon property. Unusual sounds echoed through the forest at night, not animal calls, but not quite human either. A rhythmic tapping, like a code but following no recognizable pattern. Humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Most disturbing were the reports of figures seen standing motionless among the trees at dusk, watching houses where children lived. These watchers never approached, and when confronted, they retreated deeper into the forest, moving with an odd gliding gait that witnesses struggled to describe. The incidents weren't confined to the immediate area. In a settlement 10 miles away, the new school teacher discovered her classroom rearranged overnight, desks formed into a circle around a pile of coal dust with a child's footprint pressed into it. In Williamsburg, 60 miles away, a librarian found books on local mining history removed from shelves and stacked in precarious towers, pages marked with handprints that tests later showed contained minerals found only in the specific coal seam beneath Hannon land. A stagecoach driver reported seeing a child standing on the road ahead of his team, disappearing when the horses reared, but not before he clearly heard the boy say, "Thomas wants you to visit the quiet place." By November, several families had abandoned their homesteads, leaving everything behind in their haste to escape. The exodus might have continued had winter not come early that year, sealing the mountain communities under heavy snow. For 3 months, Hannon Hollow was effectively cut off from the outside world. What happened during those isolated winter months remains largely unknown. The few accounts that exist come from James Hannon's wife Martha, who fled the hollow in early March 1777 as soon as the snow began to melt. Martha arrived at a settlement 30 miles away with her infant daughter Lily. She was emaciated. Her hair turned completely white, despite being only 24 years old. She told a horrific tale of her months in the snowbound hollow, of Jeremiah Hannon conducting strange ceremonies in the abandoned mine, accessing it through a hidden entrance in the root cellar of the main house. She spoke of Margaret speaking in Thomas's voice during what the family called the quiet hours, of Catherine drawing endless pictures of children standing in a circle around a black pit. She described Gertrude, the grandmother, finally emerging from her room as the snow deepened, revealing skin covered in strange markings that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Most disturbing were Martha's descriptions of what she called the visitations. Throughout the winter, figures would appear in the hollow, standing motionless in the snow, watching the houses. These weren't human trespassers. They would appear suddenly, leaving no tracks in the snow, unaffected by the bitter cold, despite their thin clothing. Some resembled people who had died or disappeared. Rebecca stood among them, her eyes now dark, empty sockets, her mouth frozen in a serene smile. William appeared later, changed in similar ways. And always with them was Thomas, looking exactly as he had before his disappearance, except for his eyes, which had become solid black, reflecting light like polished coal. Martha claimed that James had tried to stop whatever was happening, arguing violently with his father. "It's gone too far," she reported him saying. "Thomas found it by accident, but you're inviting it in now." The threshold was never meant to be a doorway in both directions. One night in February, she said, James simply didn't come home. The next morning, Jeremiah told her that James had joined Thomas in the quiet place. When Martha demanded to know what he meant, the entire family surrounded her in the yard, speaking in unison. He understood at the end. They all do. The threshold needs Hannons on both sides. For weeks after that, Martha had hidden in her cabin with Lily, blocking the doors and windows, venturing out only when absolutely necessary for food or firewood. She described how the hollow had changed as winter deepened, how the snow seemed to absorb sound completely, creating a silence so profound it was physically painful. How she would sometimes see impossible things in the forest, trees that bent at unnatural angles without breaking, animals that moved in perfect synchronization as if controlled by a single mind, brief glimpses of landscapes that couldn't exist in our world, visible through what looked like tears in the air itself. The final straw came when she awoke one night to find Catherine standing over Lily's crib, whispering to the infant in the family's strange language. Catherine hadn't used the door. There were no footprints in the snow outside, no signs of how she had entered the locked cabin. When confronted, Catherine smiled and said simply, "She needs to learn the quiet speech before the threshold opens fully. All children do." The next day, Martha packed what she could carry and fled. Martha's story reached the colonial authorities through a sympathetic minister who documented her account. A militia was dispatched to investigate Hannon Hollow as soon as weather permitted. What they found there in April 1777 became the subject of a report so disturbing that it was immediately suppressed by the local magistrate. According to courthouse records, the document was stored in a special archive until 1827, when a fire destroyed that section of the building. Whether this fire was accidental remains a matter of speculation. The official statement released to the community was brief. The Hannon family had perished during the harsh winter, likely from disease or starvation. The property was declared abandoned. Within a year, Hannon Hollow was deserted, the cabins reclaimed by the forest. The main house stood empty for decades, gradually collapsing under the weight of seasons, until nothing remained but the stone foundation and chimney. But there were whispers. There are always whispers in the mountains. Settlers who attempted to reclaim the hollow reported odd occurrences, tools that moved overnight, the sensation of being watched, a child's laughter echoing from the sealed mine shaft. Within a generation, the hollow was considered cursed, a place to be avoided by anyone with sense. The most detailed unofficial account of what the militia found in Hannon Hollow comes from a journal kept by one of the officers, Lieutenant Daniel McAllister. The journal remained in his family's possession until 1863, when his great-grandson donated it to a historical society. 3 pages related to the Hannon investigation were missing, apparently torn out. But the remaining entries paint a disturbing picture. April 4, 1777, reached Hannon Hollow today. Snow still deep in shadows, no signs of life. Main house standing but dark. Cabins appear abandoned, no bodies visible. Strange symbols carved into trees along approach, unlike any I've seen before. Not Indian or settler markings, something else. April 5th, entered main house. Empty of people but possessions left behind, as if residents stepped out momentarily. Food on table rotted, books open on desks. Found disturbing drawings in what appears to be a child's room. Not childish scribbles, but precise geometric patterns, complicated designs beyond my understanding. Wilson says they resemble calculations his father, a mathematician at Harvard, once showed him, relating to theories of space and dimension. How would a child know such things? April 6, discovered entrance to tunnel system beneath house. Root cellar conceals shaft that appears to connect with mine workings. Captain refuses to allow exploration without proper equipment. I observed strange dust around entrance, not coal dust, finer, slightly luminous in darkness. Collected sample. April 7th, page missing. April 8th, page missing. April 9th, page missing. April 10th, evacuation ordered, all materials to be burned, site condemned. Wilson in field hospital, condition worsening. Captain has requested meeting with magistrate. No one is to speak of what was found. God help us if what Martha Hannon said is true. The journal continues after a gap of several weeks, but McAllister never again directly references the Hannon investigation. Instead, his entries become increasingly paranoid, filled with vague references to watching shadows and voices in the walls. He describes being unable to tolerate silence, keeping people talking, or music playing constantly in his home. The final entry, dated September 1777, reads simply, "They've found me. I hear Thomas singing." McAllister was found dead in his home the following day, the official cause listed as heart failure, though the coroner's private notes mention expression of extreme terror and unusual post-mortem rigidity. The story might have ended there, lost to time like so many frontier tragedies, if not for Elizabeth Price. In 1847, Price was a young woman with an unusual interest in historical records when she became fascinated by local legends about Hannon Hollow. Unlike previous researchers, Price approached her investigation methodically, tracking down descendants of those who had known the Hannon family and retired officials who might have access to sealed records. Most doors closed in her face. Those who did speak offered only fragments, often contradicting each other. But Price persisted, piecing together the narrative I've shared so far. Her breakthrough came when she located Martha Hannon, still alive, but confined to an asylum in Philadelphia. Though elderly and often confused, Martha recognized Price as someone who might understand. During 3 visits, she elaborated on her earlier account, filling in details about the Hannon family that had never been made public. According to Martha, the Hannons weren't just a family, they were caretakers. For generations, they had protected and maintained the threshold, located deep in their primitive mine. This threshold, Martha claimed, was a passageway to what she called the quiet place, a realm that existed alongside our own, but governed by different laws. The Hannons' duty was to ensure that what belonged in the quiet place stayed there, and that the boundaries between worlds remained intact. This arrangement began with Jeremiah Hannon's father, who had fled Ireland not because of famine, but because he had discovered something beneath his property there, a vertical fissure in the rock that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Those who gazed into it reported seeing impossible landscapes, geometric forms that hurt the mind, and entities that moved in ways that defied understanding. The quiet people don't use words the way we do, Martha explained during her second interview with Price. They think in patterns and rhythms. When they try to speak as we do, it comes out wrong, like music played on instruments that weren't meant to exist in our world. The Hannons learned to communicate with less speech, to listen for meanings between words, to feel the patterns underlying ordinary things. That's why they seemed so strange to everyone else. They were becoming like their friends. Instead of fleeing or sealing the cavern, the elder Hannon made a pact. Martha was vague about the details, but she indicated that he communicated somehow with the entities beyond the threshold. He would protect their doorway, keep it secret, and provide occasional passage in exchange for certain benefits: knowledge, influence, protection from harm. The family's subsequent survival and modest prosperity on the frontier wasn't due to luck or skill, but to this arrangement. The Hannons' peculiar traits, their silence, their odd customs, were adaptations, Martha claimed, ways of making themselves compatible with their otherworldly associates. Thomas had discovered the threshold accidentally while exploring the mine, finding a back entrance that Jeremiah had failed to secure properly. He crossed over, Martha said, and brought something back with him, something that slowly changed him. Jeremiah recognized the signs from family lore and tried to reverse what was happening, but it was too late. The quiet place had tasted Thomas, and now it wanted more. The boy disappeared not because he wandered off, but because Jeremiah and the older family members performed a ritual to return him to the quiet place, hoping to seal the threshold. They failed. Whatever door Thomas had opened remained ajar. The quiet people Martha described were neither human nor spirit, but something between, entities from that other realm who could now cross into our world. They took Mary Collins to see Thomas as a message to the Hannons. The old arrangement was broken. The threshold needed a new caretaker, a new Hannon. When Price asked why the entities had returned Mary while keeping Thomas, Martha's explanation was chilling. They needed her to be a messenger, a demonstration of their reach. But she wasn't a Hannon, so she couldn't stay. The threshold requires Hannon blood to maintain its stability from both sides. That's why they took Rebecca next, then William. They were preparing. Preparing for what? Price asked. Martha's most disturbing claim involved the family's ultimate fate. During that snowbound winter, she said, Jeremiah finally accepted what needed to be done. One by one, the remaining Hannons were given to the threshold in a series of rituals. They didn't die. They crossed over, joining Thomas in the quiet place, becoming guardians from the other side. James had resisted, trying to escape with Martha and Lily, but the entities took him. Martha survived only because of an old superstition Jeremiah honored. A mother with a nursing infant was temporarily immune to the quiet place's influence. They're still there, Martha told Price during their final meeting. Not dead, just elsewhere, watching through the tear between worlds, waiting. Sometimes they reach through when the boundaries thin. They take things, leave messages. They want to be remembered. When Price asked what they were waiting for, Martha's eyes filled with tears. For the hollow to fill again, for new caretakers. The threshold must always have a keeper, always. During this same interview, Martha made a confession that she had apparently never shared with authorities or even her doctors. Lily wasn't her biological child. The real Lily had died shortly after birth, a fact Martha had kept from James. The infant she had fled with, also named Lily in her mind, had been orphaned when one of the mining families succumbed to influenza. Martha had taken the child hoping James wouldn't notice the substitution, driven by both grief and fear, that without a nursing infant she would be taken like the others. The false Lily died anyway, Martha whispered. 2 years after we escaped, the quiet people found us somehow. They sent a visitor. I found it standing over her crib one night, just looking at her. Not touching, just looking. It had Rebecca's face, but not her eyes. Never her eyes. The baby took sick the next day. Wasted away to nothing in a week. Doctors couldn't explain it. Price asked if Martha had seen any other visitors over the years. They check on me, Martha replied, suddenly calm. Different faces each time. People I knew from the hollow mostly. They don't speak, just watch. Making sure I remember my promise. What promise? Price asked. Martha refused to elaborate, ending the interview abruptly. When Price returned the following week, hospital staff informed her that Martha was no longer accepting visitors. Price's repeated attempts to see her again were unsuccessful. Martha Hannon died in the institution 5 years later, in 1852. Price detailed these claims in a 300-page manuscript titled The Threshold Keepers of Hannon Hollow. She submitted it to a publisher in May 1848. It was never published. 3 weeks later, Price herself disappeared while conducting one final site visit to the ruins of the Hannon property. The only trace ever found was her notebook, open to a page containing a single sentence. I hear Thomas singing. A search was organized, but heavy rains washed away any potential tracks. Dogs brought to the site refused to approach the foundation of the main house, growling and backing away. After a week, the search was abandoned. Price's disappearance was attributed to a fall into one of the many unmarked mine shafts that dotted the area. The same explanation given for Thomas Hannon's vanishing 70 years earlier. The Price investigation might have ended there, buried like everything else connected to the Hannon mystery. But in 1923, a geology student named Robert Chen discovered Price's manuscript while researching coal mining techniques for his thesis. The document had been misfiled in a university archive, tucked between records of early industrial development. Fascinated, Chen decided to follow Price's trail, with tragic results. Chen's body was found in the ruins of the Hannon house on October 15, 1923. The official cause of death was exposure, though the coroner noted several anomalies in his report. Chen's body was perfectly arranged, hands crossed over his chest. His eyes were missing, with no signs of animal predation. And despite lying outdoors for what appeared to be several days, no insects had approached the corpse. Most strange was the expression frozen on Chen's face, described by the coroner as profound peace. Chen's research notes, recovered from his university apartment, revealed that he had located what he believed to be the sealed entrance to the abandoned mine. His final entry, dated October 12th, read, "Found carved symbols matching those in Price's manuscript. The threshold is real. Going back tomorrow with better equipment. I need to see for myself." Among Chen's possessions was a small voice recorder. When university officials played the cylinder, they found mostly field notes and observations, consistent with his written journal. The final recording, however, was different. Chen's voice sounded strained, excited. "I'm inside the passage now. Found a way around the collapse, just like Martha described. The air is different here, colder, denser somehow. My flashlight beam doesn't penetrate as far as it should. The walls are... Wait, there's something odd about the mineral composition. The coal seam has unusual striations, almost like writing, not English, not any language I recognize. And there's a sound, very faint, rhythmic, like breathing, but not quite. I'm going deeper. The passage slopes down at an unusual angle. It doesn't match any of the survey maps I studied. This shouldn't... Wait. There's a chamber ahead. Large. My light won't reach the ceiling. The floor is... It looks like it's been polished smooth. In the center there's a... I don't know how to describe it. A vertical crack in the air itself. It's completely black, but somehow reflects light differently than simple darkness would. It's beautiful. I think this is it. The threshold Martha described. There's a child standing beside it. A boy. He's smiling at me. He's saying something. I'll try to get closer so the recorder can pick it up. The recording ends there. A sudden click followed by silence. No screams, no struggle, just an abrupt termination. The cylinder was analyzed by audio experts who found no signs of tampering. The last 10 seconds contained an anomaly. Beneath Chen's voice, barely audible, was what sound engineers identified as a child singing in reverse. When the segment was isolated and played backward, the words became clear, "The quiet place has room for more." After Chen's death, the entire area was declared hazardous and access restricted due to unstable ground conditions. The few remaining structures were demolished. The road leading to Hannon Hollow was removed from county maps. Today, the location exists in a kind of official limbo, neither park nor private property, simply unmarked forest land that local residents avoid without exactly knowing why. But the story refuses to die. Every few years, someone else becomes obsessed with the Hannon mystery. Academic researchers, paranormal investigators, thrill-seeking teenagers. They find fragments of the tale in dusty archives or on obscure internet forums. They piece together maps, rediscovering the overgrown paths to where the hollow once thrived. Some never return from their expeditions. Others come back changed, quieter, their eyes somehow different, their interest in the case suddenly extinguished. A few report encounters, a child watching from between trees, figures standing in circles in forest clearings, strange symbols appearing on their belongings afterward. Most are dismissed as publicity seekers or delusional. The most recent incident connected to the Hannon mystery occurred in 2019. A true crime podcaster named Darius Webb announced a special series on the banned story of Hannon Hollow. After 2 episodes establishing the historical background, Webb traveled to West Virginia for on-location research. His final social media update showed a selfie taken on a forested trail with the caption, "Think I found it. The air feels different here. Recording starts in 5. Webb never posted again. Search and rescue teams found his equipment 3 days later, a high-end digital recorder, headphones, and notebook arranged neatly at the base of a large oak tree. The recorder's memory had been wiped clean. The notebook contained pages of childish drawings, stick figures, standing around a black circle. Webb himself was never found. The case remains open. This brings us to the question that has haunted everyone who encounters this story. What really happened to the Hannon family in 1776-77? Was it simply a series of tragedies, magnified by isolation and superstition? A case of mass hysteria or family madness? Or was Martha Hannon's incredible claim true, that some doorway exists in those mountains, a threshold to a quiet place that occasionally reaches into our world? I don't have a definitive answer, but I can tell you this. While researching this story, I discovered something that neither Price nor Chen nor any other investigator seems to have noticed. County birth records show that Martha Hannon's daughter Lily, the infant who supposedly escaped the hollow with her mother, died of fever in 1778, barely 2 years old. Yet Martha lived until 1852. For decades, she was confined in that asylum, receiving only one visitor, a young woman who came monthly, signing the guest book simply as L. Hannon. Hospital staff described this visitor as unusually quiet, with old eyes in a young face. She always brought Martha the same gift, a small jar of blackberries. After Martha's death, the visit stopped. When hospital administrators tried to contact L. Hannon regarding funeral arrangements, they discovered the address she had provided didn't exist. Perhaps most disturbing is what happened to Martha's body after her death. It was transferred to a funeral home for burial beside her infant daughter. But according to mortuary records, when the casket arrived and was opened for final preparation, it was empty. The sealed document detailing the investigation into this incident has been misplaced from archives. So what are we left with? A centuries-old mystery with no solution. A family that vanished. A hollow that emptied. A succession of investigators who either disappeared or abandoned their search. And always those whispers in the mountains, of a threshold of quiet people watching from the trees, of a boy named Thomas who found his way into another world and opened a door that never fully closed. I'll end with this. 2 months ago, I received an envelope containing a single sheet of paper. On it was written, "Thomas is still waiting at the threshold." The handwriting matched samples of Elizabeth Price's writing I had examined in the archives. The postmark was from a small town 30 miles from Hannon Hollow. The date was May 15th, 2023, 175 years after Price disappeared. I don't know what it means. I don't want to know. This is the last video I'll make about the Hannon mystery. Some stories should remain untold. Some places should remain unfound. If you're watching this from anywhere near the mountains of Appalachia, I urge you again, don't look for Hannon Hollow. Don't seek the threshold. And if you ever find yourself in the forest at dusk and feel you're being watched by silent figures among the trees, don't look back. Just run. Run until you reach noise and light and people who speak freely. Because the quiet people are still there, waiting for the next caretaker of the threshold, waiting for the next Hannon